Good evening, everybody. I'm Gretchen Crosby-Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are pleased to welcome Laura Rosenberger and Jamie Fly to campus this evening for an absolutely vital conversation on the Russian government's efforts to undermine faith in our democratic institutions and what we need to do about it. I want to make a few mentions of upcoming events. Tomorrow, we will be welcoming former Secretary of Health and Human Services Tom Price in conversation with Dean Catherine Baker of the Harris School of Public Policy. Next Wednesday, May 2nd, we'll host a panel discussion on the surge of women running for office in 2018. You can find out more about this and other upcoming events on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We will open up the floor to take questions from the audience after our discussion. We will be passing microphones around, so please raise your hand. As usual, we'll give priority for the first three questions to students. We remind you that a question ends with a question mark. We ask that you please keep your phones on silent. Put them on silent now. Notifications as well. Restrooms are on the first floor. And now here to formally introduce our speakers Briggs Deloach. Briggs is a first-year master's student from Columbus, Georgia, with the Committee on International Relations. He studies international security and has been a regular attendee at speakers' events here at the IOP this year. Please join me in welcoming Briggs to the podium.
All right, thank you, Gretchen. It's an honor to be able to introduce this pair of foreign policy experts today who are joining us as part of their crusade to root out Russian threats to subvert American democracy. In many ways, the experiences of Jamie Fly and Laura Rosenberger could be seen as carbon copies. Both are senior fellows with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Both are members of the Council on Foreign Relations, and both have served in positions with the National Security Council. Yet what makes this combination of scholars so unique is in their individual differences. In an era of political polarization, Mr. Fly and Ms. Rosenberger have come from experiences on opposite sides of the aisle to unite behind a common cause. Before his current work, Mr. Fly was a longtime aide to Republican causes, having worked with Senator Rubio on foreign policy questions, as well as in the George W. Bush administration. And Ms. Rosenberger had had some more experiences on the Democratic side of the aisle, working on Hillary Clinton's 2016 election effort, as well as in the Obama administration. As a recent Politico article put it, the efforts of these two individuals started as the product of a blind foreign policy date. And while these two individuals came together in this blind fashion, this certainly has not hindered their efforts to have a strong vision for securing our democracy. So we look forward to their insights. And moderating our conversation today will be Ms. Kimberly Dozier. Ms. Dozier serves as a global affairs analyst with CNN. And throughout her career, Ms. Dozier has covered a range of foreign policy and security questions for a number of different outlets, including CBS News, the Associated Press, and the Daily Beast. So please help me in welcoming our panel today.
Briggs, thank you very much. Thank you to the Institute of Politics for bringing us here. I think none of us have been in Chicago for a long time, and to see such a turnout to discuss this topic is heartening. I spend a lot of time talking about it on CNN or covering it as a journalist, and I like to start with, easy questions. So, in whatever order that you all prefer, my first question is Russia trying to destroy us?
So I don't think Russia's trying to destroy us. I think we need to be careful, even though Laura and I are working on a project that's trying to learn the lessons from what happened with Russian interference in 2016, make sure that we can build resilience to deal with these tactics going forward. I don't think we should overhype the threat. Russia is essentially, in many respects, a declining power, has major economic issues, major demographic issues, and some of these tactics that I think we're seeing being used against us are not really to wipe the U.S. out. It's to throw us off balance, to push back against perceived slights that especially Vladimir Putin has about U.S. policy over several administrations. And so I think this is really these tactics, the interference in European democracies, American democracies, are more a sign of weakness than a sign of Russian strength.
I totally agree, but I also think that part of what they're doing is trying to weaken us, right? They are acting from a point of weakness. Putin is acting from a point of weakness, but he is trying to weaken us because that is really because Russia is a declining power. The only way that Putin can gain strength is in a relative fashion, and that is by weakening us. And Putin understands that our democracy is one of the cores of our strength. And so hitting us where we're strongest, trying to weaken those pillars, is one way for Putin to attempt to weaken us. And a lot of the tactics, which we can get into later, do involve trying to sow division, exploit division, sow chaos, all of this kind of stuff. But I agree with Jamie that we also need to keep it in perspective.
So let's dig into those tactics, the what, where, when, how. What is the primary way that they try to influence U.S. democracy?
Well, it's through a variety of tools, and if you just look at what we've now learned about the 2016 case in particular, although I think it's important to note that this was not just something that was happening in the run-up to the 2016 election, many of these tactics continue to be used to this day to try to influence American politics. Many of these tactics have been used in some cases for decades, including going back to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, so-called active measures. And many have been used against our European allies, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, to try to influence their politics for quite some time before they kind of crossed that threshold of trying things here. We break them into several categories. We look at disinformation, influencing certain messages in the American political debate, and we talk more later about how they actually do that. There are financial tools that are used, both here in the US to try to buy influence. Many foreign countries already do this. There's certainly no lack of foreign influence attempts in Washington using financial means, but the Russians have tried to do that here. They've tried to fund certain fringe groups in Europe before, actually fund political parties. There's also cyber hacking, which again occurs by many actors, but in the Russian case, what's often done is the combination of the cyber hacking with then disinformation, so stealing information from the DNC, stealing John Podesta, senior Clinton campaign officials' emails, and then giving it to WikiLeaks, which can then be pushed out with certain disinformation.
So pushed out with some possibly fake emails mixed in with the real
Yeah,
ones. So
the problem is
which.
it's done in a way that it's in such large quantities that no media organization has the time or the ability to verify the information. We saw a similar attempt in the run-up to the French elections and the victory of now President Macron, where there was a data dump at the last minute in that campaign. The final tool we see them use is economic coercion. This has been more of an issue in Europe. It's a concern in the US as well. It's using the energy sector to try to extract concessions from certain European countries to make.
Can you give us an example? Because so these active measures, you've started with the disinformation, which I guess most of us experience in social media or in news media, and then you moved on to the stealing of information and how it could be weaponized, but this economic coercion, that sounds like it's a nation state versus nation state.
A key part of their pressure on many Central and Eastern European countries has been through controlling energy flows. It benefits the Russians financially. It also makes these countries dependent in almost every way, politically at the end of the day, certainly economically, on Moscow. They also then combine that, if you look at the role of many former European politicians. The most notable case is former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who then gets a plum position on the board of a Russian energy company. And so they exert influence then in the German debate about sanctions post-Russian annexation of Crimea or because of Russia's intervention in Ukraine. They have these figures of influence in the political scene in many capitals that they can call on and use to lobby their case, essentially.
And there's an element of kleptocracy to some of that as well, right? So to the extent that Putin has an ideology, which I think we can come to in a moment, but it's really actually just about sort of corruption and kleptocracy and what that means for Putin's own power and the ability to undermine others through the use of corruption as a weapon. And so I think that intersects with some of what Jamie was just talking about as well in terms of recruiting, whether it's politicians or other kinds of proxies that can be essentially beholden to the Kremlin or speak on its behalf at some points in time by using corruption and other means to facilitate that relationship.
And yet, if we had, just to play devil's advocate, if we had Ambassador Antonov sitting here, or if you follow the Russian embassy on Twitter, or Sputnik, or TASS, they put out very cogent, convincing arguments that all they're doing is trying to expand Russian influence. So when does economic influence and trying to get yourself positioned to have greater diplomatic influence become economic coercion, for instance?
I mean, some might argue in some of these cases, I think with some of the tools it's clearer than others. There is a fine line because, as I said before, of course there are many foreign countries that certainly that have embassies in Washington, but others that also use some of these tools to try to curry favor with Congress, to support certain legislation. The U.S. has a legal structure. You have a similar structure in certain European countries, but it's to varying degrees about what's legal activity, what's illegal. Mm-hmm. In the case of Russia, there have been multiple instances, again, some of it which we're now seeing from 2016, where laws were violated, where you can hire a lobbyist.
Campaign finance laws.
Campaign finance, you can hire a lobbyist to advocate on your behalf if you're a foreign government in Washington, but you have to declare that you're lobbying on behalf of a foreign government.
This is called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, aka FARA. It's a very arcane piece of, anytime I wrote about it, I would always get together with a legal specialist to try to understand it. But it's something that is hard to pin down, and seldom ever does someone who has violated FARA get prosecuted for it. I think maybe twice in the past 20 years has DOJ, the Justice Department, ever followed through with trying to prosecute someone for it.
Part of the challenge on some of these issues too is that there are vulnerabilities in our own system that can make some of this activity more possible. And so, for instance, some of the loopholes we have with respect to purchase of real estate and the ability to use shell companies and the ability as well actually to use law firms for what are essentially lobbying purposes, but to not actually have to call it lobbying. There's a whole host of basically loopholes in our financial and regulatory system that allows for dark money to move in. And to me, that's really where the distinction comes into play here. Sort of what is just countries trying to spread influence, which, by the way, is what sort of diplomacy is all about. And so ideally that's through soft power means, but of course there's the hard power tools as well. But I think what we're talking about here is this kind of covert activity that's trying to be coercive in a way that is not transparent, that is trying to undermine others and not just actually transparently engage in influence.
So one of the main tenets of your project is to name and shame, to call out this activity. So perhaps now, the three of us are steeped in this. We read about it and see it every day, follow it on Twitter. But perhaps for some people in the audience that aren't following it every day, can you take them through some specific examples of each case? We've heard about the Internet Research Agency, for instance.
So the disinformation piece has gotten a lot of commentary, but it's perhaps the most instructive because it's one area where it's incredibly important to have more transparency and more awareness, because the targets are basically all active, civically minded Americans. The financial influence and others are often very targeted in terms of who they're going after. So what we saw with the Internet Research Agency, and this has all been revealed now mainly by the tech companies, also in the initial indictment by Special Counsel Mueller, we saw a concerted effort by this organization, which essentially was a troll farm in St. Petersburg, Russia, to have Russian operatives masquerade as Americans on social media, set up fake accounts, set up fake chat rooms on a whole host of social media platforms, and engage Americans in political conversation, put out targeted messages at different groups within American society, appealing to both political parties, appealing to supporters of Hillary Clinton, of supporters of Donald Trump, appealing to minority groups, African Americans, Muslim Americans, with targeted messaging that was in part intended to just sow chaos, pit various groups of Americans against each other, in some cases suppress voter turnout, convince some segments of the population that it's not even worth voting, that the system is rigged. The frightening thing, I think, for us, and we're continuing to track some of this activity, even though many of the Internet Research Agency accounts have been shut down, there are still other networks on many social media platforms that to this day, post-election, continue to push some of this divisive messaging. The concerning thing is...
And this is everything from white supremacy themes to...
across the political spectrum.
To Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter.
To
Just to try-
Texas secessionism
Just to-
and Muslim rights.
So just to try to find the seam between different American communities and drive a wedge in there, make it
Drive a
worse.
wedge. And also, I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who ask, well, could anybody's mind have really been changed about who to vote for based on what they saw on social media? And the reality is that's not what the Internet Research Agency efforts were trying to do. They weren't actually trying to change people's votes per se, in most cases. As Jamie said, some of this was aimed at suppressing the vote. So we saw targeted messaging at minority communities, basically saying Hillary Clinton doesn't stand for African Americans, Hillary Clinton doesn't stand for gay rights, that kind of stuff, trying to suppress enthusiasm among certain key communities for her. You also saw, on the flip side, some messaging that basically talked about how Hillary was sort of in favor of Muslim rights and showing her with figures from the Muslim community, but that were targeted at more right-leaning conservative audiences. Basically trying to say, if you're thinking of voting for Hillary Clinton, just know that she's pro-Muslim. And so trying to basically, again, target an audience that the Russians calculated would be not in favor of that kind of approach. And so I think that it was a very actually sophisticated effort in some ways in terms of the messaging. I mean, some of it was unsophisticated. Some of it fell very flat. And I think that's one of the things that's important to remember here is that because this is a pretty low-cost effort, and because Putin and his team acting kind of from this position of weakness feels like they can take a lot of risks, they actually were able to throw an enormous amount of spaghetti at the wall and just see what stuck. And some of it stuck and some of it didn't. And we often tend to focus, I think, in the American discourse about these issues on what stuck. And the reality is some of it didn't. And I think that's also instructive for us to learn from.
So the places that we would have seen this, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn,
Tumblr,
Reddit,
Right.
Instagram, Pinterest.
Yeah.
who among them has been the best at rooting out that activity? Want to hand out any good grades, any failing grades?
Well, I think that across the board, the tech companies are still wrestling with this challenge. I think, one of the things that's striking to me is I was in the State Department and then later at the White House during much of the Arab Spring. And at that point in time, we were talking about social media as this incredible democratizing force and the way that it was able to connect activists in authoritarian countries to organize in ways that were never possible before. And what the Internet Research Agency and other Russian efforts have been able to do is to figure out how to turn that against us. And I think the key question is how do we maximize the upsides of these technologies while minimizing the downsides? So all that being said, in terms of where they are at in this process, I think it's still very much in the learning phase of how have these things been exploited, while the reality is that the threat is actually evolving even as we're sort of still learning about the backward-looking piece. So I don't really have full confidence that on any of the platforms we really still know the full extent of what's happening on them in the ways that they're being manipulated by adversarial nation states, let alone sort of how they might be manipulated in the future.
And the concerning thing for me is how long it took for the platforms to realize that that their products were being utilized by this foreign actor. The U.S. government was caught off guard as well, I think, and didn't really see this in real time the way they should have. But people forget that it really was only last summer that many of the platforms began, after multiple rounds of questioning and some self-assessments, to produce evidence of these Internet Research Agency linked accounts. And it was only after several of the congressional committees, mostly the Senate Intelligence Committee, began to exert pressure on the companies and try to provide them with some information for them to then go back and look at what had happened in the run-up. And it's still ongoing. Just, I think, within the last 2 weeks, Reddit, for instance, finally released a list of accounts that they shut down that were tied to the Internet Research Agency. I mean, again, the Internet Research Agency was indicted several months ago at this point. And so we're well behind, I think, where we need to be in terms of having that real-time understanding of how these platforms are being exploited. Hopefully, going forward, the platforms will build in either more personnel or just more checks and balances to try to track this activity in real time, but it's been a painfully slow process.
Now, since there isn't some sort of facility to track that in real time, you all have built a dashboard that's trying to do that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we believe, sort of as Jamie referenced a bit earlier, that one of the things that's really key to combating these tactics is actually shining sunlight on them, exposing them. Transparency is in many ways the antidote to a lot of these very covert tactics. And so we've worked with a team of analysts who've been watching the Russian information operation networks for almost 4 years now, and have basically developed a sort of public tool that tracks the messaging being pushed by one of these networks on Twitter. Now, Twitter is not a representative sampling of all the social media activity. One of the things we actually know now is that different social media platforms play a different role in this broader information ecosystem. But Twitter is an area where elite opinion is shaped, where what journalists decide to cover and focus on often gets driven, where members of Congress kind of get their news. And so if you want to target
Presidents.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, there's been some really fascinating studies done of looking at some of the accounts that try to reply most quickly to his feed and then ideally get a retweet from him occasionally. It's pretty interesting the way that you can use social media to target particular figures. But in the Russian case, what we're doing is basically trying to get a better understanding of what are the issues that these accounts are weighing in on, and what is the messaging they're driving, what are the narratives that they're interested in portraying, because we think that that's really important, both, again, to number one, understand what messaging is being driven from from these Russian-linked accounts, what they want us to be talking about, and then how do we ensure that in our own conversations we're actually not repeating Russian disinformation, and that it's called out in a very clear way.
So could you give me two more examples? One example of how they hired some sort of lobbyist and pushed a certain line or something like that in the United States, and then one example of economic coercion.
On the lobbyists, I mean, the concerning case, which we still haven't seen the final outcome of, is, I think, the Manafort case in particular. Clearly now, Paul Manafort, who had served for a certain period of time as now President Trump's campaign manager, has now been indicted and is being prosecuted. But here you have a case
Being prosecuted for taking money from?
For not declaring that he was acting as a foreign agent, basically under the statute we talked about previously.
For a political party in Ukraine that is backed by the Russians.
Yeah. And there's no question, I think, of who he was actually working for at the end of the day about this party. He filed a registration after he realized he was under investigation. We see that case as just symbolic, though, of the broader problems with the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which you referenced earlier. I don't believe that Manafort is the only one doing this sort of thing in Washington or in the country. There are plenty of people who are engaging in lobbying on behalf of foreign entities and are not declaring. It's just he, unfortunately, eventually rose to be the campaign manager to one of the two parties' nominees to be president, and he faced additional scrutiny. But there are plenty of other individuals making significant amounts of money. In his case, I think it was between $10 and $20 million, maybe even more, who were not registering. And so it exposed some flaws in our regulatory structure. It raised questions about whether the Department of Justice and FBI have the resources they need to actually implement existing law. And so that's, I think, the most prominent example from the 2016 case. There are many others that I think have yet to be discovered, but that one in particular, I think, has received the most scrutiny.
In the energy space, one of the literal cases where Russia has sought to turn off the gas as a form of trying to basically undermine faith in government's ability to provide for its people is Ukraine, where having illegally annexed part of the country, having invaded part of the country, that not being quite enough for Russian efforts to undermine Ukrainian democracy, have actually used the gas pipeline into Ukraine and Ukraine's dependency on Russian energy as a form of gaining both influence over the government and undermining the faith of the Ukrainian people in the government's ability to provide for the people. I mean, again, thinking about this from the perspective not just of elections, but of the broader goal of Putin in weakening democracy and undermining democratic institutions, undermining people's faith in the government's ability to provide for it is one way that we have seen this manifest. The other example I'd mention is another way in which we see these different tools interact with each other. I mean, I think Jamie and I have been struck by how in the government world, we often tend to stovepipe each of these different pieces, but in many ways they interact with each other. And so we've seen a lot of the Russian government hacking networks targeting energy infrastructure. And so whether that's the electric grid of countries or power plants, one of the actually first examples that's often cited of Russian tactics in this space, in this sort of asymmetric toolkit, is their hack on Estonia, which in part included their electric grid.
Estonia is just a country of 3 million people, with Russia very nearby. So I know they've changed their entire way their internet works,
Absolutely.
the way their energy grid works.
Yeah.
So let's talk about why. Is this because of Vladimir Putin's animus towards the United States? I mean, what do they get out of this?
Well, it goes back to where we started. I think a lot of it at the end of the day is to put us off balance, to distract us, to make Americans focus more on arguing with each other rather than coming up with solutions to our broader, especially foreign policy problems. If you think about the space that's been created in recent years for Russia to do other things on the world stage, certainly its intervention in Ukraine, it's now in Syria playing a key role in the Middle East once again. I mean, I think these are some of Putin's near-term goals.
So by distracting us at home and having us riven with infighting, we're not able to coalesce as a nation behind our politicians to signal, yes, it's okay to do what we need to do in the Middle East, or it's okay to get invested.
I think that's part of it. And then the other thing that Putin can then do is project what is happening in European democracies and U.S. democracy back to his own population and say, see this mess over here, see how they can't get anything done, see how they can't tackle the problems. Do you really want democracy? Is that what you really want? And so I think there's that element that's a self-preservation element to it too. And then a lot of it gets to what Laura spoke about earlier, is just the kleptocracy and the preservation of this oligarchic structure of all these wealthy individuals around Putin who are benefiting from the system. And at the end of the day, in that sort of system, especially as Putin nears what everyone thinks will be his final term, he's really going to be focused on self-preservation, maintenance of that wealth that he's essentially stolen from the Russian people.
So essentially you're saying that the Russian people, instead of being inspired to fight against the kleptocracy that they come up against every day, to try to build towards something like a U.S. structure, instead figure, oh, it's a mess everywhere, this is as good as it's going to get.
That's certainly Putin's goal. But I do think it's really important when we talk about the threat we face from Russia to bear in mind that the distinction between Putin's Putin's Crony network, Putin's own power structures, and the Russian people. We have seen actually some of the biggest protests in Russia over the past several years have been about corruption. We know that that is one of the weakest points within Russia and within Putin's power structure. And I think there are obviously a number of democratic activists within Russia, and I think it's really important to distinguish between really in any authoritarian state that we ever deal with, between the people and the government. And this is very much a strategy that is being led by Putin and his cronies. And I think that distinction is really important, because at the end of the day, the Russian people have to be part of the solution of a more of a Russia that is actually engaged in the world in a more responsible way.
And of course, this has been articulated in something called the Gerasimov Doctrine.
Yes.
Can you all explain what that is?
So Valery Gerasimov is a Russian, very senior Russian general who's basically articulated a strategy to use sort of all means of warfare to engage in political war. And I think that's where Jamie and I really come at as we think about these tools that we just named to you, is essentially that these are being employed for the purpose of political warfare. One thing that I would just note is that a lot of the tools we have talked about, aside from the technological and cyber dimensions of this, are in many ways based on the old Soviet Union active measures playbook. This is something that is not particularly new in that sense, nor in many ways is the Soviet, or is the, slipping backwards, nor is the view of democracy as a threat from Putin's perspective. Having come up as a KGB officer, Putin really saw the West's push for democracy, the fall of the Soviet Union in a very particularly and personal way. And so I think what Gerasimov has articulated essentially sort of encapsulates what has been a strategy that's been part of was part of the old Soviet playbook, has been part of Putin's own mindset for quite some time, and really does put quite a fine point in a way, and is quite direct about using this form of political warfare to really undermine many of our democratic institutions and structures.
So it's measures just short of actual combat.
That's right.
That are aimed at undermining us at home and all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, politics as warfare, essentially, and how to undertake that in a pretty sophisticated way. And I think this is where one of the biggest challenges for the United States comes into play, or for democracies comes into play. This, what's often called in other contexts, the gray zone, where these are not tactics that sort of hit the kinetic point of military action. They often are tools that, in this context, are exploiting our free and open society to be able to attack our democracy. It poses real challenges for democracies that are, at least attempt to think of themselves as acting in a responsible way. This is upending sort of all of the principles that we see as the conduct of sovereign nations.
It raises important questions too about deterrence, because obviously in our relationship with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, we had a certain deterrent structure related to the use of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction, different warnings about if you escalate to this level, we will feel that we can use this level of response. And both in the cyber domain generally, but then in terms of responding to these sorts of tactics, I think we as advanced Western democracies have really struggled with how do you respond, how do you push back. We've seen this both in some of the European contexts. We saw it in 2016, I think, as the Obama administration saw early warning signs of some of these activities and really struggled with how do we engage the Russians to warn them away? What do we threaten them with if this continues? And so there was a whole set of those sorts of issues that we haven't really worked through. And now that we know it's happened and we know it's still ongoing, you see the Trump administration struggling with some of this as well. Well, we'll impose more sanctions on these 10 entities, et cetera. But there's no easy answer to how do you send that clear message that a line has been crossed that needs to be stopped immediately.
So let me ask the uncomfortable question, or just one of them, before I turn to audience questions. Some would say that what Russia has done in terms of, for instance, sending its troops into Syria, they did because they weren't getting pushback from the Obama administration. Some would say also the Bush administration witnessed their invasion of Georgia, also was caught sleeping when it came to Russia. Has the U.S. done enough to send a signal over time that they can't be pushed around?
No.
Were you part of any of those decisions? Okay.
No, I mean, I think Jamie and I are unified on this, and is actually why what has sort of motivated a lot of our work. I think that there were both intelligence shortcomings and there were policy shortcomings. In at least what I saw, I can directly speak to the U.S. response to Russia's intervention in Ukraine, and which is I was at the White House during that point in time, and I think that there were a couple of challenges. One is from an analytic perspective, we did not understand in the moment the full complement of what was happening on the ground. And some of that actually gets into what we were just talking about in terms of the information operations and the cyber attacks. And we were sort of stovepiped and seeing different slices of this and not putting the whole picture together. We also, there is a long-time tendency in the intelligence community to put open source information at sort of the bottom rung of intelligence analysis. But the reality is, especially when it came to some of the information operations that we saw, for instance, in the wake of the shoot down of MH17, which was the plane that was shot down over eastern Ukraine. That's one of the moments where people look back and really see the first push of major disinformation operations. And certainly was sort of a wake-up call for me.
But there was a bunch of information they tried to put out saying that it wasn't Russians, it
Correct.
wasn't Russian irregulars on the ground who had fired the missile, et cetera, et cetera.
It was, 30 different narratives to explain what could have possibly happened. Of course, all of which meant that what the U.S. government and our allies were saying had happened was not the case. And so it wasn't about trying to prove an alternative theory. It was basically this idea, that there is no truth, and it's not knowable. And so this sort of big push of information that disinformation that really came out at that time. But that was something we didn't, that our analysts didn't really understand what was happening in the moment.
That they were so good at muddying the waters that people on the ground didn't know what to believe had
That's right.
happened.
That's right.
We've seen
That's
the
right.
same thing, by the way, in recent weeks with the poisoning of the former Russian spy in the UK, the Skripal poisoning, the same litany of conspiracy theories about all the other places that this chemical could have come from, accusing various European countries or the US of being behind it. And we've seen, and Secretary Mattis talked about this as he announced the British, French, and US strikes several weeks ago on Syrian chemical weapon sites. We've seen the same sort of disinformation being pushed out by the Russians on social media and through overt Russian propaganda outlets as well.
I've seen some of it that, it might have been rebels who had actually
Oh, it might have
conducted
been
the chemical
Sweden,
attack.
It might have been Kazakhstan. It might have been, the U.S.
And I just saw yesterday, they've been going so far as to stage interviews with survivors, including a child that they claimed was there to cast doubt on whether chemicals were used or who actually initiated the chemical weapons attack. And so again, this is part of a common playbook that they use in cases like this.
But I want to come back to your question too, which is also on the policy side, because I do think, my own view is that we had a lot of debates in the Obama administration about how to respond in Ukraine, and I think that a failure to do so more assertively was read by Putin as a permission slip to continue to go further. But I think that also, was a factor of a lack of willingness by certain key European nations to come along in a more assertive fashion as well. That comes back, by the way, to this question of energy in some ways. So a number of
So
European-
Russia was putting energy pressure on some European countries, so they didn't want to join in
Exactly.
a tougher effort
Correct.
pushing back against
Correct.
Russia and Ukraine.
Correct.
Okay.
So it's all a bit of a cycle in that sense. But I do think that that this really has been a failure, sort of on multiple levels. And what worries me in the as we look forward is we're talking about Russia here, but in Australia and New Zealand and Taiwan, they would be having a very similar conversation. They are having a very similar conversation with respect to China. Which is using some of these similar tactics. And Xi Jinping is certainly learning lessons from what Putin has accomplished and what Putin has faced or not in terms of resistance and pushback. And that worries me significantly.
I think just to pick up on Laura's commentary about the Obama administration, I mean, I think this is a decades-old bipartisan failure across multiple administrations to not get policy towards Russia right. You can argue it might even have started in the Clinton administration. There's a whole debate about whether the Clinton administration did enough to support and build up Boris Yeltsin at the time and the reformers around him. Obviously, we ended up with Vladimir Putin running the country instead. And then we had the Bush administration, which I served in, which tried to engage Putin, tried to find common ground on counterterrorism, on arms control, and we ended up with the invasion of Georgia, as you noted earlier, in 2008, in the final several months of the Bush administration. The Obama administration went through its reset. And throughout all of that time, I think both administrations missed the warning signs. They didn't listen to our frontline allies about what they were seeing on the ground, about the political pressure they were facing, economic, but then also the exact sort of meddling in European politics that we've now seen here in the US. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us to learn the lessons from this case, and as Laura said, be prepared for the future challenge and look at how others might take this playbook and use it against us and other democracies in the future. And I think, if anything, the last several decades should be a lesson that we can't miss those warning signs again next time.
Do you think this administration, the current one, has picked up on those warning signs?
It's a mixed bag, honestly. If you hear a lot of the cabinet officials, although many of them have now departed because they tend to cycle through pretty quickly, have spoken about this challenge, I think, in just the right terms. I mean, H.R. McMaster spoke repeatedly about this concern. And by the way, it's not just a U.S. or European problem. H.R. McMaster, in his final months on the job, was highlighting signs the administration had seen in the upcoming Mexican elections and Colombian elections that there was an attempt of Russian interference, which a certain political shift in Mexico could have major implications for the U.S.-Mexican relationship, for our economy, for border issues. And so it goes much broader. The president himself, obviously, again, at times has actually talked about how it's dangerous if a foreign country meddles in your election, but he spends most of his time dismissing the problem. And that's really been damaging on the right. If you look at the polling, most self-identified Republicans do not believe the Russians interfered at all. Which is very problematic because we believe that the first step is raising awareness, making people more aware of this sort of messaging, less immune to it, and we need political leadership at all levels. And there have been members of Congress, including Republicans, who are willing to do this, but we need political leaders who are willing to speak frankly about the threat and educate the public about it, and that's lacking right now at the top of the administration.
So I would like to open up to questions. Are you a student? Yes. Okay. First one. And can you introduce yourself and give your year?
Yes.
I'm not going to ask any non-students to give their year.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm a third year in the college. And I was wondering, in regards to social media and like regulating and like tracking like posts on social media, and like the project you're working on, is it not true that like social media platforms are global and anyone can post anything they want on them, and there's also lots of extreme individuals and organizations in the United States itself, like Americans, who post things that target specific groups and basically do all the same things that like the Internet Research Organization in Russia did, but they're Americans.
So what's the difference between a malign message and freedom of speech?
Yes, and also just wondering, like, to what extent do we actually even have the political right, or like the sort of the international right to track and regulate the things that other people from other countries post? Because isn't it true that anybody from another country, like, say they didn't decide to like pretend to be Americans, and instead they just were explicitly themselves, but they posted the same things, could have still had an influence, or maybe they made connections with people in the United States who they knew had similar views, and then helped them to post, and then it wouldn't have been foreign nationals posting, but rather Americans themselves. So, are you trying to fight against sort of fake news in general, or are you fighting more against like people from other countries? And if the latter is the case, then to what extent what measures can be taken? Like, what do we have the political right to do?
Okay.
I'll take a stab, and then I'm sure Laura has thoughts. I mean, you raise all the complexities of this challenge, especially when it comes to disinformation on social media. We as a project have not really endorsed sweeping regulation of the social media companies. The main push we've supported on that front has been on something called the Honest Ads Act, because there are different aspects to what you're talking about and different aspects to the tactics. Some is just someone creating a fake persona and pushing out content, acting like they're an American and engaging other real Americans in political conversation. That's much more difficult to tackle. I'll get to that in a minute. But what we also saw with the Internet Research Agency was the actual purchasing of political ads on social media. Now, there's a debate about how many ads were purchased and what the ultimate impact of that was, how many Americans they reached. But that is an attempt to circumvent US campaign finance law, which if you buy an ad in a newspaper or purchase a radio spot or a TV ad, you need to be an American and you need to declare who you are. That, up until now, those rules were not being enforced on most social media platforms. Now most of the social media companies have basically endorsed this Honest Ads Act. It hasn't passed yet, but that would deal with the regulation of political advertising, especially related to campaigns on social media, which we think is an important step to close off that vulnerability. The other issues you highlighted are just incredibly difficult, and there the question really comes down to whether the individuals on those platforms were violating the terms of service of the platforms. So each platform has different rules about how you have to behave if you're a user on those platforms, whether you have to be a real person. I think some of them do require, they want only, ideally, real people, not bots. Some of this is now changing. I think the platforms are now looking at some of those rules. There is evidence, though, in the case of the Internet Research Agency, that even the ads that were just essentially political speech, or even, the posts that were just political speech, violated the terms of service of those platforms. And again, that's really up to the companies at the end of the day. What we usually say about Twitter, Facebook, all these other platforms, at the end of the day, we just need Americans who use social media to engage in political activity to be informed, educated consumers of information. And we need to raise awareness about the dangers of social media in that respect. And the fact that you're engaged in a chat room or a group with someone you think is someone living 2 towns over or 1 state over, they may not even be American. They may be fake. They may be a bot. They may be pushing out. They could work for a corporation that has a particular interest. That's the ultimate solution to this. We're not for banning social media platforms or saying that you only have to be an American to be on a social media platform. But some of those issues, as you outlined, are incredibly difficult to work through. And that's the conversation that at least we're now beginning to have and the social media companies are starting to have.
I'll just add a couple broad points. The first is, I think Jamie and I really come at this from the perspective of what we're trying to protect is our democracy. And in doing so, we can't undermine any of the principles of that democracy. And that means that free speech has to be core to the answer. Constraining speech, regulating content, any of that kind of activity is not something that we think should be part of the answer. In fact, we think it would actually put us in a race to the bottom. And so that's kind of principle number one. And so that, I think, when it comes to your question about Americans have certain views and how do we deal with that kind of content, that's up for, that needs to take place in the American political debate, and we need to have conversations about those issues. I think Jamie and I both believe that, as a bipartisan effort, that the more conversation we can have across different, party lines and outside of the echo chambers is important. But those are legitimate views that need to be aired in the American public discourse. What I do think is important on your question about the accounts that are from foreigners, et cetera. One is, this is where I would go back to the distinction I was drawing between, in the Russian case, the Russian people and the Kremlin and its cronies, right? That's sort of one piece, right? And another piece is just bearing in mind that the Internet Research Agency has now been indicted under, by the U.S. Department of Justice for conspiracy. And I think that is just important to bear in mind, in the sense of, we're not talking about just a group of Russian activists who are actually engaging in some kind of real discourse. We are talking about a government-funded operation run by an adversarial nation state trying to attack our country. And that's where I think the distinction here comes into play.
Next question. Thank you very much. Yes.
Hello, I'm Asya Akcha. I'm in the MA in IR program here. I was hoping to ask you all, how could the Obama administration reacted more appropriately to what happened prior to the election? Like, what would have been the appropriate official response? And to our knowledge, were there any covert responses? I don't know if that's even assumed, but yeah, I would love to hear more about those.
Didn't Obama give Putin a piece of his mind on the side of some?
So on the marches of the G20, Obama gave Putin a warning but it was very narrowly tailored. And this is where I think I would go back to one of the things I was talking about earlier, which is the importance of seeing the full picture. And if you look at some of the accounts and talk to, neither Jamie nor I were in government at that point in time. Jamie was on the Hill, and so hearing some of it there. But one of the striking things I think you hear from people who were part of that decision-making process was how much they still weren't aware of that was happening, how much they weren't seeing the full picture. And there was a very, very clear focus by the Obama administration on ensuring that the voting process itself wasn't tampered with, that there wasn't interference in the actual voting machines, that there wasn't changing of the votes or manipulation of the vote counts. That was some of the things that they were most concerned with. And in fact, I don't even think we've mentioned, and as we were talking about some of the tools that were used, is the fact that more than about 24 states had their parts of their state election of the infrastructure, their election infrastructure, probed by Russian hacking networks. And so there was a real legitimate reason for the Obama administration to be worried about that. What they hadn't factored in was the idea of the information operations. Even once the hacked emails started coming out publicly, the scope of what was happening on social media really did not become clear until after Election Day. So we have a structural problem in our government that is not able to grasp and see the full picture of what's happening, and therefore mount an effective response. And that's something that, regardless of administration, has got to be tackled. I do think that there was a real concern by the Obama administration as well about not playing into a partisan argument about calling out activity that was aimed at helping one candidate and hurting another, and being accused then of putting the thumb on the scales themselves. And this is a question that Jamie and I have talked extensively about, is going forward, how do we ensure that in a national security decision-making process, that kind of decision, which is really core to a national security concern, can be taken out of a partisan context? And I think it's a real difficult question.
And what's now been revealed from those months as well is that there was a dialogue between the Obama administration, the intelligence community, and leaders, including Republican leaders in Congress, and there was disagreement. I think there was an attempt to get a bipartisan statement put out by congressional leaders earlier on. I think on the Republican side, there was some concern about signing on to a statement on this issue, and so the politics of this in those heated months, especially of final months of a presidential election, are incredibly important. The one final thing I just note on the warning, one interesting thing, and it's hard to judge in retrospect whether this makes a difference, but if you look at some of the European cases, you had the French and German elections then after ours. If you talk to French and German security officials, they're convinced that one of the reasons, although there were attempts, but one of the reasons that there was not such extensive efforts by the Russians in their countries was the nature of the warning that was delivered by French and German officials to the Russians in very clear, stark terms about what those security agencies were seeing and warnings about specific repercussions if they went further and they actually tried to interfere more directly. Again, who knows whether that actually changed the Kremlin's calculus in some of those cases. But I do think that we need a lot of thinking and looking at what is that deterrent approach in terms of the messaging if you see this activity going on in the final months of a campaign. What do you say publicly to the American people, but then also what do you say to that foreign actor that is attempting to interfere?
Next question. Back row, sure.
I guess along those lines, talking about deterrence, how vulnerable is Russia to this same kind of threats back, social media or something similar? And is there a sense that, I recall President Obama saying that there will be retaliation. The public may not know about it, but Putin will know about it. So is there some of that going on? Can any of that?
Have there been any sort of counter-posting campaigns?
So, I mean, I don't think Jamie and I obviously aren't in government to be able to speak to anything that would be happening on the more covert side. But my own view is a couple things. One, this goes back to something I mentioned earlier. I don't believe that democracies should be engaged in undemocratic means in the name of democracy. And so the idea of sort of an information war going back in the same direction that would essentially be part of a war on truth is not something that I think is actually in our interest in the long run. What I am most interested in is understanding, Putin has tried to read what are his asymmetric advantages and how can he use those against the US and our European partners and allies. We can do the same thing and understand what are our asymmetric advantages vis-a-vis Putin. And to me, that is actually going after the thing that Putin cares about most, and that is his money. Of course, I say his money, which is really mostly money that's been stolen from the Russian people over time. And that is money that is largely invested in the West. And so he is actually quite vulnerable to US measures that would put the squeeze on the financial means of him and his crony network. I actually think that is where we are going to be most successful in being able to impose real costs on Putin for this kind of activity. Now, in the cyber domain, there are obviously a number of cyber tools that can be employed one way or another, both on the defensive and the offensive side, to be able to go after some of their means of whether it's hacking or other kinds of technical tools that they are using against us. And I think that is something that is worth consideration that relates to a broader conversation about, basically cyber conflict and the fact of there being very few clear rules of engagement in cyberspace, a fear of how quickly escalation in cyberspace could lead to actually kinetic action in one way or another. So there's a broader conversation about that, but I do think that taking some more robust action in that space is probably warranted.
Question from, ma'am.
The troll farm.
Oh, just a second. The microphone is coming your way.
The troll farm in St. Petersburg. Now that we've tried to shine the light of truth upon that, what does intelligence tell us, or what do you know about that?
I mean, I think the best information that's in the public domain at this point, there was already some media reporting about this, but is actually in the Mueller indictment of the Internet Research Agency, and it lays out in great detail the size of the operation, the amount of money that was spent on this per month, the way that employees were trained, the way they operated, It's important to highlight just the professionalism of the activity too. I think the Mueller indictment even talks about the fact that employees were kind of judged on how effective their communications were in American English, and in cases where mistakes were made and they got grammatical syntax wrong or things like that, they deleted the post and did it correctly. You know, there was actually an effort to really blend in as much as possible. And I think that's the one, I mean, in retrospect, for me, it's one of the most surprising things about how many resources were devoted to this, how professional the operation was. It was still relatively low cost in the grand scheme of things compared to normal national security or military spending of any country. But there was just such great detail and focus on these activities. There was also, I think the Mueller indictment revealed a little bit of effort to kind of scope things out in the US, but when they sent a small group of these operatives to visit the US, they tried to get a broader group in to get visas. Not all of them, some of them were rejected, so not all were able to come to the US. That aspect of it also is just interesting too, how they didn't really need people inside the US to do this. In the case of the small traveling party, I think that went around to certain US states, their research about how to target this activity was as simple as to talk to a think tank, I think, in maybe Texas it was, and just ask them about American politics and kind of where are the key states, and the answer basically came to the normal swing states that everyone in this room probably already knows about and has known about for years, and they could probably read about in the New York Times or wherever. So they didn't actually need a lot of support on US territory. This could be done remotely. The one final thing I'll highlight, which often gets missed, which was revealed prior to the Mueller indictment, but there's more detail in the Mueller indictment, which is one of the most concerning aspects of this for me. If you talk about impact, a lot of people say, as I think Laura noted before, did this change anyone's opinion? How can you judge whether it matters? There was one instance in Houston of two competing rallies on the same day at the same time of opposing groups. I think one was in support of Muslim Americans, another was Texas secessionists, where these Internet Research Agency operatives actually got Americans to take physical action and go out into the streets and protest in support of a cause. And these people who showed up at those competing rallies thought that they were drawn there by fellow Americans. And the Mueller indictment actually documents several other instances of similar cases of Americans going out. I think in the Mueller indictment, the other examples were for pro-Trump rallies, where they thought they were organized by other Americans. And there are now some of those individuals who went to those rallies have now been tracked down and interviewed by reporters. And these people honestly thought that they were just listening to the advice of someone who lived several streets over and coming out to support a candidate they liked. Now, they may have done that anyways if they liked that candidate, but that's a truly frightening aspect of this, where you can have people who are not American citizens sitting abroad who can actually lead Americans to take some sort of physical action. And I think it's something that's one of the most concerning aspects of what we've learned about the Internet Research Agency.
You can download the Mueller indictment, and I'd recommend reading it. It's fascinating, the detail, and it was enough detail, plus they must have presented evidence to back it up for a jury to indict. Now, will those Russians ever see time in an American courtroom? Probably not. But the roadmap is there. This is how it was done. Is there a question from that side of the room? Sir? Oh, ma'am.
Thank you. I have a good question for you, and if you can't answer this, don't. I wonder, I wonder what your opinion is about the teenage hacker, doxer, squads that have been operating, especially the ones that have been going after getting into the emails of FBI agents and the head of the FBI and the head of the CIA, and have been swatting universities all over the nation, which certainly causes a lot of chaos and unrest. I'm referring to groups like Lizard Squad, Crackers with Attitude, Russell League, Poodle Corps, and this boy Kane Gamble. Do you think that they're operating on their own accord, or is somebody... Do you think that they're...
I don't know if Russians would know that Poodle Corps is really pretty cool as a name.
Yeah, I mean, because they have been, going after all that, I think, to embarrass people, getting into their emails, posting them online, swatting universities all over the nation. Do you
So,
think they're just
any
operating
proof?
on their own accord, or is somebody pushing them?
I haven't looked into that one directly, and I don't know that I can speak to whether or not anybody is sort of behind the scenes pushing them, or they're operating on their own accord. What I would just say is, in general, obviously, hacking is not something that is the purview of just sort of the Russian government or the Chinese government. I mean, hacking of our systems across the board has been a challenge that we have seen growing as more and more of our information is online, as we're more and more dependent on the internet. And I think that that's why some of these measures that we were talking about in terms of shoring up our cyber defenses, et cetera, are important from multiple dimensions. It's protecting ourselves from for-profit hackers who may be American. It's protecting ourselves from hackers who may just be trying to sow discord for their own reasons, or from foreign adversarial hackers.
One other thing I'd add is I am very concerned about, this has been going on for quite some time. I think there were former Bush administration officials too, Colin Powell and others, who had their emails hacked and embarrassing information leaked. The Russians certainly did a version of that with the John Podesta hacks. It's now going well beyond the Russians, though. Right now in Washington, there is a shadow war essentially going on between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates on one hand and Qatar on the other. And a lot of it is being driven by the media getting inboxes of different players. We had the Emirati ambassador's email hacked, and the contents shared with media organizations who quickly ran all kinds of stories.
Well, I got that, and I refused to run it.
Yeah.
Because
And-
I couldn't prove what was in it, and I was like, are these anonymous, so-called anonymous hackers really white hat hackers who are giving me this information? How much of this is really written by the UAE ambassador, and what else has been tucked in there? And I couldn't verify it, so I wouldn't run it.
Yeah.
And those are the right questions to be asking.
Yes.
So one more question.
You mentioned open source reporting. Recently there was an article in Wired about a researcher at Madison who had somehow collected a whole bunch of ads just ahead of time during the election and did some analysis of that. I'm wondering whether you know whether that data set or other data sets like that have been cross-referenced with the targeting that the Trump campaign has used to see whether there's any significant overlap in the targeting between, Russian-based ads and the Trump campaign-based ads.
So the information you're referring to from the University of Wisconsin researcher is fascinating, actually. And one of the most fascinating parts of it is that what this researcher had done, for anyone who hasn't seen this, is she asked, as a lot of researchers do, as we now know sort of is a vulnerability that Cambridge Analytica exploited, was to ask Facebook users to, in this case, to sort of agree to download a plugin that allowed for her to collect all of the ads that were coming in to these individuals' feeds. And so the one point I would make on that is it gave a really interesting overview of ads that were being run. It's not necessarily a representative sample in the sense that it was sort of people who chose to download or agreed to download this plugin. But this researcher went in thinking she was just going to be looking at political advertising in general. And it was only after the election and after the revelation about the Internet Research Agency's purchasing of these ads that she realized and cross-referenced it with that she had a bunch of the content of the Russian purchased ads in what she had been able to collect. And so it's a really interesting example of research that you set about for one purpose, ending up giving you other information. But in terms of the cross-referencing with what the Trump campaign did in terms of micro-targeting, I mean, I'm not aware that information is publicly known, and so I don't know of any research that has cross-referenced that specifically.
And I don't have any information about that either. My concern, though, is about that is where this threat could go, where it could become even much more damaging and impactful in the long run. We're learning more and more, I think now, post-Cambridge Analytica, about how much data the tech companies have about all of us and our activities. online, our interests, things like that. The Chinese in particular, because of all of the cyber hacks, they've already stolen sensitive information about tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of Americans. If you really wanted to try to mess with our democracy, you could get to the point where you could micro-target these kinds of messaging that we've been talking about. I'm not convinced the Russians threw enough resources at this in 2016. I'm not even sure that they, quite frankly, would have the wherewithal and the ability to do it going forward. But other actors, especially China, that's where this may all be going in the future, and it raises all kinds of privacy concerns, concerns about the company's responsibilities that I don't even think we as a society have begun to tackle.
So you're saying that they haven't been throwing spaghetti at the wall. They have the ammunition that they could throw darts at individual
I think it's
targets.
the question in the future will be is will they adopt similar tactics? Will they be willing to be as brazen at the end of the day and risk a broader confrontation with the U.S.? They have a much stronger hand, I would argue, than the Russians, and so they may apply their influence in different ways. But I think, again, this project is all about closing off vulnerabilities, building resilience in our society, and dealing with some of these privacy issues and having a broader societal conversation about them, I think is an important first step.
So I would like to ask the last question of the audience. How many people in this room believe the Russians hacked the 2016 elections? Hacked or tried to influence. So how many do not believe the Russians were trying to do that? Okay, so at least there are people who are on the fence. You might not have convinced them that the Russians were involved in this campaign. So why, as a closing thought to the two of you, why is our society so vulnerable to this, and do you think it's getting any better?
So I think there's a couple of reasons that we are vulnerable to this. I think one of the biggest ones is our polarization. I think that the hyper-partisan environment in which we are existing in this moment and have been, I think, increasingly over time, has created an environment where exploitation was all too easy. I think that on the technological side, I think we are living in a transformative moment that we don't quite even fully understand the full wave crashing over us. But what has happened in that sense has been that we have moved very quickly in creating things without understanding the full implications of what we are creating. And so I think that getting on top of those vulnerabilities is really important. But to not totally close on doom and gloom, I am a big believer that democracy has enormous strengths, and I believe that if we can keep focusing on how to shore up those fundamental pillars of our democracy, that is actually what is going to make sure that we prevail in the end. I do believe that democracy will thrive as long as we actually do the hard work to tend it. The reality is, I think many of us who used to believe that once consolidated, that democracy would just sort of continue on its own inertia, have now seen very clearly that, in fact, we need to keep investing our resources in the upkeep of our democracy, and that's where we need to be focusing.
I agree with Laura. I think at the end of the day, we have a much stronger hand. We're in a much stronger position, so we can adapt and get through this. Have we made progress? I'm pretty pessimistic about major governmental reforms in this current political environment, partly because of what we've talked about and how this is seen by many as being tied into the collusion investigations, and I think being used for partisan advantage by both sides, honestly, in many cases. So I'm not, in the near term, that optimistic about immediate change in government policy. But at the end of the day, even that wouldn't solve the problem. It's about building that societal resilience we've talked about. And part of that is just having this conversation. And there's much more conversation and awareness about this challenge now than there was even 6 to 9 months ago. And so I think that's progress in and of itself.
So as individuals, we should read the article before we retweet it or share it and make sure we know who wrote it. And also make an effort to reach across the aisle, follow the example that you two have set here today. So with that, thank you both very much, and thanks to the Institute of Politics. And thanks for your questions. Good night.